Crécy, northern France, August 26, 1346. While French crossbowmen relied on steel-prod weapons firing 2 bolts per minute at 200 yards, English peasant archers stood in open fields with simple yew-bows that French nobles called bent sticks for hunting rabbits. Master Thomas of Macclesfield had spent months training 7,000 farm boys to fire 12 arrows per minute in coordinated volleys, a technique Marshal Guillaume Bertrand dismissed as impossible against proper armored cavalry. French commanders laughed at the sight. 9,000 English commoners positioned with their backs to a forest, facing 30,000 professional soldiers, including 8,000 Genoese crossbowmen and 12,000 heavy cavalry on destriers. They called it suicidal. They called the English cowards hiding behind wooden stakes. King Philip's knights were already discussing victory feasts when the first charge began at 4:15 in the afternoon. Then English arrows started falling like deadly rain. 70,000 arrows per minute saturated the battlefield, while French crossbow strings, soaked by afternoon humidity, lost 30% of their power and couldn't reach English positions. Within 1 hour, 1,500 French nobles lay dead among 2,200 slaughtered warhorses, their expensive plate armor useless against systematic industrial killing. Standard cavalry charges that had dominated European battlefields for centuries crumbled against coordinated peasant archery. What did Thomas understand about mathematics, weather conditions, and coordinated firepower that the finest military minds in France completely missed? If you value stories of medieval innovation that shattered centuries of military tradition, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented tactical revolutions worth discovering. The morning mist hung thick over the rolling hills of northern France as French scouts galloped back toward King Philip's massive encampment, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. What they reported to Marshal Guillaume Bertrand de Briquebec seemed almost too absurd to warrant serious consideration. The English army had positioned itself on a hillside near the village of Crécy, backs to a forest, in what appeared to be the most tactically suicidal arrangement any military commander had witnessed in decades of European warfare. Guillaume examined the intelligence reports with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of heavy cavalry warfare across the battlefields of Flanders and Gascony. 9,000 English soldiers faced his 30,000 professional troops, a numerical disadvantage so severe that it bordered on madness. But the composition of Edward's army struck him as even more ridiculous than the numbers. 7,000 of the English force consisted of peasant archers, men who had learned their skills hunting deer in English forests, now standing in open fields with what French nobles mockingly called bent sticks. The weapons themselves appeared primitive beyond belief when compared to French military technology. English longbows measured 6 feet in length, crafted from simple yew wood that any village carpenter could work. French crossbows, by contrast, represented the pinnacle of medieval engineering, steel prods generating tremendous power, sophisticated trigger mechanisms, and effective ranges of 200 yards. The Genoese crossbowmen in Philip's army were consummate professionals who had trained for years to master their complex weapons, each man capable of delivering 2 to 3 steel bolts per minute with devastating accuracy. Guillaume's tactical calculations seemed to confirm French superiority in every measurable category. His heavy cavalry consisted of 12,000 knights mounted on destriers, warhorses weighing 1,400 to 1,600 pounds, bred specifically for battlefield shock tactics. Each knight wore a complete suit of plate armor weighing 60 pounds, carried a 12-foot lance, and had trained from childhood in mounted combat techniques that had dominated European warfare for 3 centuries. The financial investment represented by a single French knight exceeded what an English peasant might earn in his entire lifetime. The English position appeared even more insulting when Guillaume studied their defensive arrangements through his personal spyglass. Thousands of wooden stakes had been driven into the hillside soil, creating what looked like a farmer's fence rather than serious military fortification. The archers stood behind these pathetic barriers in triangular formations, completely exposed to cavalry charges. Most shocking of all, English men-at-arms had dismounted and stood on foot beside the archers, abandoning the mounted combat that defined noble warfare. French confidence reached levels of genuine amusement as commanders examined English equipment in detail. The longbows required tremendous physical strength to draw. Estimates suggested 150 to 180 pounds of force, but their construction remained laughably simple. Yew-staves cut from trees, shaped by hand tools strung with hemp or silk. A village craftsman could produce a functional longbow in 3 days, while a steel crossbow required weeks of specialized metalworking by master artisans. The tactical doctrine behind English archery struck Guillaume as equally primitive. Traditional archery focused on individual marksmanship, hunters shooting single arrows at specific targets. Military archery, as practiced by French crossbowmen, emphasized precision shots against individual enemy soldiers protected by shields called pavises. The English appear to have arranged their archers for mass volleys, a technique that sacrificed accuracy for volume, and seemed to demonstrate fundamental misunderstanding of how missile weapons functioned in serious warfare. Guillaume's assessment of English leadership proved equally dismissive. Edward III had earned some reputation during Scottish campaigns, but fighting Highland clansmen hardly qualified as preparation for facing the military might of France. The English tactical commander appeared to be a commoner named Thomas of Macclesfield, a man whose military experience consisted primarily of Welsh border conflicts. French nobles questioned how peasant commanders could possibly understand the sophisticated cavalry tactics that had made French armies dominant across Europe. The strategic situation seemed to confirm French superiority beyond any reasonable doubt. Philip's army included 8,000 Genoese crossbowmen, professional soldiers whose services commanded premium prices across European battlefields. These men had fought in Italy, served various princes, and mastered their weapons through years of constant warfare. They carried large shields, wore brigantine armor, and operated in coordinated formations that had proven effective against the finest infantry forces in Europe. French heavy cavalry represented an even more overwhelming advantage. Knights like Jean de Hainaut and Count Alençon had spent decades perfecting mounted shock tactics, learning to coordinate lance charges that could shatter any infantry formation. Their destriers had been trained to trample foot soldiers, and their armor could deflect most missile weapons at reasonable ranges. The psychological impact of heavy cavalry charges had broken enemy morale countless times across battlefields, from Flanders to Gascony. The economic mathematics seemed to guarantee French victory as decisively as tactical considerations. Philip's army represented an investment of hundreds of thousands of pounds, sterling, armor, weapons, horses, and training that had consumed the wealth of French nobility for an entire generation. English archers carried equipment worth perhaps 5 shillings per man: a yew-bow, hemp string, cloth arrows, and basic leather protection. The financial disparity suggested military capabilities so uneven that the coming battle would serve more as an execution than a genuine contest. Guillaume's final assessment dismissed English preparations as the desperate measures of a trapped army. Edward's positioning with backs to forest suggested planned retreat rather than genuine tactical confidence. The wooden stakes indicated fear of cavalry rather than sophisticated defensive planning. The massed archery formations appeared to be last resort measures by commanders who lacked proper siege equipment, crossbow companies, or sufficient men-at-arms to contest French forces using conventional military doctrine. As afternoon approached and French forces prepared for what promised to be a brief and decisive engagement, Guillaume felt the satisfaction of a professional soldier facing inferior opponents. His tactical experience, superior equipment, and overwhelming numerical advantage would soon demonstrate why French military doctrine had conquered territories from Scotland to Sicily. The English had brought hunting tools to contest the finest army in Christendom. 3 o'clock in the afternoon brought the moment Guillaume Bertrand had anticipated with professional satisfaction. King Philip's signal banners unfurled across the French lines as 8,000 Genoese crossbowmen advanced in perfect formation toward the English position. These were not conscripted peasants, but seasoned mercenaries whose steel-prod weapons had broken enemy formations from Milan to Bruges. Their coordinated advance represented the most sophisticated missile warfare technology available in 14th century Europe. a systematic application of mechanical engineering that would soften English resistance before French heavy cavalry delivered the decisive blow. The Genoese moved with practiced precision, each man carrying a crossbow worth more than an English archer's annual income. Steel prods generated tremendous power through mechanical advantage, driving quarrels with enough force to penetrate any armor at 200 yards. Large pavises, wooden shields reinforced with leather and metal studs, protected the crossbowmen during the lengthy reloading process that sophisticated weapons required. The tactical plan was methodical: advance to optimal range, deliver devastating volleys against English archers who lacked proper shields, then withdraw as French cavalry charged against broken men. But late afternoon atmospheric conditions created variables that French tactical planning had not considered. A brief summer rainstorm had passed through the area 30 minutes earlier, leaving humidity levels at nearly 100%. The moisture-laden air began affecting crossbow performance in ways that became apparent only as the Genoese closed to combat range. Crossbow strings, constructed from twisted sinew and hemp fibers, absorbed humidity rapidly. As moisture content increased, string tension decreased proportionally, reducing both effective range and projectile velocity. The technical degradation occurred systematically across the entire Genoese formation. Crossbows that normally achieved 200-yard accuracy found their effective range dropping to 150 yards, then 140 yards, as humidity continued affecting string performance. Rate of fire, already limited by complex reloading procedures, slowed further as dampened strings required additional effort to draw fully. What had begun as a coordinated advance by professional soldiers gradually became a frustrated struggle against malfunctioning equipment. English longbowmen, positioned on their hillside, had prepared for exactly these conditions through techniques learned during Welsh border warfare. Master Sergeant Robert Lee Archer had trained his men to keep bowstrings dry by wearing them beneath their shirts during rain, a simple precaution. That proved tactically decisive. You would, unlike mechanical crossbow prods, actually performed better in humid conditions as increased moisture made the natural material more flexible rather than less effective. At 250 yards, English archers began their systematic response to the advancing Genoese. Thomas of Macclesfield's training innovations became immediately apparent as 7,000 longbowmen fired not as individuals, but in coordinated volleys. Welsh mountain tactics, adapted for open battlefield conditions, produced concentrated arrow storms rather than scattered individual shots. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. English archers firing 10 to 12 arrows per minute versus Genoese crossbowmen managing only 2 bolts per minute with degraded equipment. The technical superiority of English methodology revealed itself through sustained fire discipline. Each archer carried 60 to 72 arrows in leather sheaves, with bodkin-point specifically designed for armor penetration. Arrow shafts measured 30 inches in length, crafted from ash wood and fletched with goose feathers for optimal flight characteristics. Most importantly, standardized arrow specifications allowed for predictive aiming techniques impossible with individually crafted projectiles. Genoese crossbowmen found themselves facing tactical impossibility as English arrows began falling among their formations. Professional soldiers who had dominated battlefields across Europe discovered that their sophisticated weapons could not reach enemies who were systematically killing them. Pavises that normally provided adequate protection proved insufficient against the volume of incoming projectiles. Arrow fall density reached 15 to 20 projectiles per square yard, making coordinated movement extremely hazardous. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical damage. Genoese mercenaries were accustomed to methodical warfare where their superior equipment guaranteed tactical advantage. Instead, they faced industrial-scale killing from opponents they had dismissed as primitive peasants. Professional pride battled survival instinct as crossbowmen realized their expensive training and sophisticated weapons were worthless against English coordination and weather-adapted equipment. Within 10 minutes of engagement, Genoese casualties mounted beyond sustainable levels. 1,200 professional soldiers lay dead or wounded, struck down by English arrows while their own quarrels fell harmlessly short of target. The survivors faced a tactical decision that violated every principle of mercenary warfare: continue advancing into certain death or retreat from an engagement they could not win. The Genoese withdrawal began as individual soldiers sought cover, then became a general retreat as unit cohesion collapsed under sustained arrow fire. These were not cowards, but experienced professionals who recognized tactical impossibility when they encountered it. 800 wounded men stumbled back toward French lines, leaving behind equipment worth thousands of pounds sterling and professional reputations built over decades of successful campaigns. King Philip, observing the retreat from his command position, interpreted Genoese withdrawal through the lens of traditional military thinking. In his experience, mercenaries retreated only when bribed by enemies or when their courage failed at crucial moments. The possibility that superior English tactics had rendered Genoese weapons ineffective seemed impossible to accept. Professional soldiers equipped with the finest missile weapons in Europe could not be defeated by peasant archers using primitive hunting bows. Philip's tactical response reflected this fundamental misunderstanding of what was occurring on the battlefield. Rather than recognizing that English innovations had neutralized his crossbow advantage, he ordered immediate cavalry charges against what he perceived as treacherous mercenaries blocking his path to victory. French knights, eager to close with their inferior opponents, received orders to ride through the retreating Genoese formations regardless of casualties to their own allies. The scene that followed violated every principle of coordinated medieval warfare. French heavy cavalry, the finest mounted soldiers in Europe, deliberately trampled their own crossbowmen in desperate eagerness to reach English lines. 400 Genoese soldiers died beneath the hooves of French destriers as knights pursued personal glory rather than tactical coherence. The sight of professional allies being murdered by their own commanders completed the demoralization of surviving Genoese forces. As French cavalry thundered toward English positions, Thomas of Macclesfield prepared his archers for the ultimate test of their systematic training. The approaching knights represented everything French military doctrine considered invincible: individual courage, expensive equipment, and mounted shock tactics that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. In 2 minutes, they would discover what 70,000 arrows per minute could accomplish against charging horses. 4:15 in the afternoon brought the thunderous sound of 1,500 French knights spurring their destriers toward English lines in the first coordinated cavalry charge of the battle. Count Alençon led the assault, his banner streaming above a formation that represented the military elite of Europe, each man the product of decades of training, thousands of pounds in equipment, and absolute confidence in mounted shock tactics that had proven invincible across battlefields from Flanders to Gascony. The ground trembled beneath hooves as 12-foot lances dropped to couched position, and French nobility prepared to demonstrate why heavy cavalry had dominated medieval warfare for 3 centuries. Thomas of Macclesfield watched the approaching charge through eyes trained in Welsh mountain warfare, where small archer groups had learned to survive Scottish cavalry raids through systematic fire discipline rather than individual heroism. His tactical innovations became immediately apparent as 7,000 English longbowmen responded not with panicked volleys, but with coordinated precision. Captains' commands echoed across the hillside as different archer companies received specific target assignments, creating overlapping fields of fire that would saturate the battlefield with projectiles rather than relying on random accuracy. The English tactical system revealed its sophistication through methodical execution of techniques that French military doctrine had never encountered. Rather than aiming at armored knights who might survive multiple hits, English archers directed their fire primarily at the massive destriers carrying them. A knight encased in 60 pounds of plate armor could continue fighting despite arrow wounds, but a 1,500-pound warhorse struck by broadhead arrows became uncontrollable regardless of its rider's skill or courage. Mathematical precision governed English fire patterns as Thomas's training methods produced coordinated destruction. 1,000 arrows launched simultaneously in massed volleys, followed by rolling fire from different sections that maintained continuous pressure without gaps in coverage. The systematic approach eliminated the traditional archery problem of individual shooters firing at random intervals, creating instead a mechanical rhythm of death that operated with industrial efficiency. The technical devastation began within seconds of the cavalry charge entering optimal range. 7,000 archers firing every 6 seconds produced 70,000 arrows in the first minute of engagement, creating arrow fall densities that transformed the battlefield into a killing zone where survival became statistically impossible. Each destrier presented a target profile of 8 to 10 square feet, and English arrows found necks, chests, and unprotected legs with lethal consistency. French knights discovered that their sophisticated training had not prepared them for systematic industrial warfare. Individual combat skills perfected through years of practice against worthy opponents proved meaningless against coordinated firepower that killed anonymously and efficiently. Knights who had spent lifetimes mastering single combat found themselves dying beneath arrow storms fired by enemies they never reached, their personal courage rendered irrelevant by English tactical innovation. The cascade effect of fallen horses created geometric progression in tactical chaos. Each destrier that crashed to earth became a 12-foot obstacle for following riders, forcing subsequent waves of cavalry to navigate increasingly difficult terrain while arrows continued falling. Within 1 minute of the charge beginning, 400 horses lay dead or wounded, their riders trapped beneath 60 pounds of armor that made rapid remounting impossible. Count Alençon himself, leading from the front according to chivalric tradition, watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into desperate individual struggles for survival. Knights trained to fight as coordinated formations found themselves scattered across a battlefield littered with obstacles, each man reduced to personal combat against systematic destruction that cared nothing for individual prowess or noble birth. The psychological breakdown proved as devastating as the physical casualties. French nobility had built their entire social identity around military superiority that justified feudal privileges and political power. Discovering that English peasants could kill them effortlessly challenged fundamental assumptions about divine right, noble blood, and the natural order of medieval society. Knights who had never doubted their inherent superiority faced the horrifying realization that their expensive training and sophisticated equipment were worthless against coordinated firepower. Sir John de Luxembourg, the blind king of Bohemia, embodied the tragic nobility of French courage, rendered meaningless by tactical innovation. Having himself tied between two knights, he charged directly into English arrow storms with full knowledge that his gesture would accomplish nothing beyond honorable death. His sacrifice symbolized the collision between individual heroism and industrial warfare, personal courage maintained at the cost of tactical effectiveness. The mathematical reality of English superiority became undeniable as casualty figures mounted. Average horse casualties reached 67 animals per minute during the height of the charge, while knight survival rates after losing their mounts dropped to 23% due to armor weight that made movement nearly impossible. English arrows penetrated chainmail at ranges exceeding 200 yards and found plate armor gaps at 150 yards, making French defensive equipment inadequate regardless of its cost or sophistication. French military commanders, observing the slaughter from command positions, struggled to comprehend tactical realities that contradicted centuries of successful experience. Guillaume Bertrand watched professional soldiers dying in heaps, while English casualties remained virtually non-existent, but his conceptual framework had no explanation for what he witnessed. Heavy cavalry charges that had broken every enemy formation in living memory crumbled against peasant archery that operated like mechanical death-dealing machinery. The second and third cavalry charges, ordered in desperate attempts to salvage French honor, encountered increasingly impossible conditions as successive waves of knights attempted to advance over fields littered with 800 dead horses and 600 fallen comrades. Each assault faced not only continuous arrow fire, but terrain, transformed by previous failures into obstacle courses that made coordinated cavalry tactics impossible to execute. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, French forces had suffered tactical casualties that exceeded anything in European military memory. 800 nobles lay dead among the wreckage of their mounts, while 400 more survived as wounded prisoners, whose ransoms would enrich English coffers for years. The finest heavy cavalry in Europe had been systematically destroyed by coordinated archery that French military doctrine had dismissed as unsuitable for serious warfare. Thomas of Macclesfield surveyed the battlefield with professional satisfaction, knowing that his systematic application of Welsh mountain tactics to open battlefield conditions had proven English methodology superior to French military tradition. But King Philip, desperate to salvage feudal honor from complete disaster, was already preparing one final assault that would commit everything remaining of French military power to a last desperate gamble against English innovation. 5:30 in the afternoon witnessed King Philip's final desperate gamble as he committed every remaining soldier to one massive assault that would either salvage French honor or destroy what remained of his army. 2,000 surviving knights, 6,000 infantry, and his personal royal guard prepared for a coordinated attack that represented the last organized force of French feudalism charging against English tactical innovation. The stakes transcended mere military victory. If this assault failed, 5 centuries of European military tradition would die alongside French nobility on the slopes of Crécy. Thomas of Macclesfield recognized this moment as the ultimate test of systematic archery against traditional warfare. His archers had been deliberately conserving arrows for exactly this situation, with each man retaining 35 to 40 shots in their leather sheaves. The longbow system that French commanders had dismissed as primitive hunting equipment was about to operate at peak industrial capacity, transforming English peasants into a coordinated killing machine that would demonstrate the mathematical superiority of disciplined firepower over individual courage. English tactical preparation reached levels of mechanical precision that medieval warfare had never witnessed. Captains' orders established overlapping zones of fire with different archer companies assigned specific target areas across the battlefield. The systematic approach eliminated gaps in coverage while preventing ammunition waste through redundant targeting. 7,000 longbowmen functioned as components in a military machine designed for maximum efficiency rather than chivalric display. The mathematical parameters of destruction exceeded anything previous medieval battles had achieved. Peak fire rates reached 84,000 projectiles per minute as English archers fired 12 arrows every 60 seconds in coordinated volleys. At 200-yard range, arrow density achieved 15 to 20 projectiles per square yard, creating killing zones where survival became statistically impossible regardless of armor quality or individual skill. Systematic coverage ensured that no area of the battlefield remained unsaturated with English arrows. French infantry, advancing behind the remaining knights, discovered immediately that their basic military equipment provided no protection against arrows designed for penetrating plate armor. Men wearing simple mail or brigantine faced bodkin-points that passed through their defenses like parchment, creating casualties that mounted geometrically as formations dissolved under sustained fire. Infantry companies that had maintained cohesion during previous campaigns broke apart as soldiers fell in systematic rows, their deaths as anonymous and efficient as grain harvesting. The industrial nature of English warfare became apparent through its complete indifference to traditional military values. French soldiers died without individual recognition, their personal courage meaningless against coordinated firepower that operated mechanically rather than heroically. English archers fired, reloaded, and aimed with systematic precision that reduced warfare to manufacturing processes, producing death with the same methodical efficiency that workshops produced cloth or metalwork. Individual French knights, dismounted after losing their destriers, attempted to reach English lines on foot in final gestures of feudal honor. Encased in full plate armor, they moved at walking speed while arrows poured down like deadly rain. Some advanced 50 yards through pure determination, a few reached 100 yards through superhuman courage, but none achieved 150 yards from English positions. They died maintaining chivalric traditions that had become tactically obsolete, their sacrifice honorable but strategically worthless. The systematic destruction revealed fundamental changes in how warfare functioned when industrial methods replaced aristocratic individualism. Traditional battles had featured personal combat between worthy opponents, allowing individual prowess to influence outcomes through single combat victories or tactical brilliance. English archery eliminated such possibilities by killing enemies before they could engage in personal combat, reducing French military effectiveness to zero, regardless of training quality or equipment sophistication. Captain Jean de Hainaut, surviving the assault through combination of luck and tactical awareness, witnessed the complete transformation of medieval warfare from chivalric contest to industrial slaughter. French nobles who had spent lifetimes perfecting individual combat skills died anonymously in heaps, their expensive equipment and sophisticated training worthless against coordinated firepower that cared nothing for personal reputation or feudal status. The economic devastation exceeded military casualties in long-term significance for French society. Each dead knight represented 2 to 3 years of agricultural revenue, while total French losses approached 50,000 pounds sterling in destroyed equipment alone. 2,200 destriers, warhorses that required years of specialized breeding and training, lay dead among the wreckage, representing agricultural capacity that could not be quickly replaced. English tactical superiority manifested through ammunition management that demonstrated industrial thinking applied to medieval warfare. Thomas of Macclesfield's archers had fired approximately 500,000 arrows during the 4-hour engagement while maintaining coordinated volleys until the final French assault collapsed. Supply logistics that supported sustained fire rates of this magnitude required planning and organization that traditional medieval armies had never attempted. The psychological impact on surviving French forces exceeded physical casualties in demoralizing effect. Soldiers who had entered the battle confident in their military superiority discovered that English peasants could systematically destroy European nobility using techniques that French doctrine had never considered seriously. The fundamental assumptions underlying feudal society, that noble birth and expensive equipment guaranteed military dominance, had been proven catastrophically false. French casualties by 6 o'clock reached levels that constituted national disaster rather than mere battlefield defeat. 1,500 nobles lay dead alongside 800 wounded, representing the military leadership of an entire generation destroyed in a single afternoon. English casualties totaled 40 deaths and 120 wounded, mostly men-at-arms who had engaged in hand-to-hand combat with French survivors who managed to reach English lines. The duration of effective French resistance, 3 hours and 45 minutes, demonstrated how quickly systematic firepower could neutralize traditional military advantages when properly coordinated. English archery had transformed medieval warfare from contests of individual prowess into industrial processes, where mathematical principles determined outcomes more reliably than personal courage or expensive equipment. As sunset approached, the Battle of Crécy had effectively ended with French forces retreating in complete disorder. King Philip himself, wounded by English arrows, escaped with fewer than 100 knights from an army that had begun the day with 30,000 men. The battlefield belonged to English forces who walked among piles of French dead, systematically finishing wounded enemies with practical efficiency that replaced chivalric mercy with tactical necessity. The immediate tactical victory, however, represented only the beginning of changes that would transform European civilization. 4 hours of coordinated archery had destroyed not merely French military power, but the fundamental assumptions underlying medieval society, proving that systematic innovation could defeat traditional methods regardless of their historical success or social prestige. Evening shadows stretched across the battlefield of Crecy as French survivors stumbled away in complete disarray, their retreat marking the end of an era that had defined European warfare since the time of Charlemagne. King Philip himself, bearing arrow wounds that would scar him permanently, escaped with fewer than 100 knights from the 30,000 men who had begun the day confident in their military invincibility. English forces methodically secured the field, walking among heaps of French dead and finishing wounded enemies with practical efficiency that demonstrated how completely warfare had been transformed from chivalric contest to industrial process. The numerical accounting of destruction revealed casualties that exceeded anything in European military memory. 1,500 French nobles lay dead among 2,200 slaughtered destriers, representing not merely tactical defeat, but the systematic elimination of an entire generation of military leadership. Each fallen knight had required 10 to 15 years of training and represented financial investment equivalent to a peasant's lifetime earnings, making the economic impact of Crécy as devastating as its immediate strategic consequences. English casualties totaled 40 dead and 120 wounded, creating a casualty ratio that defied every assumption underlying medieval military doctrine. Brother Geoffrey of St. Albans, documenting the aftermath with monastic precision, recorded technical details that would influence European warfare for centuries. English longbow methodology had achieved systematic superiority through innovations that French military tradition had never seriously considered. Rate of fire advantages, 10 to 12 arrows per minute versus 2 to 3 crossbow bolts, had proven decisive when multiplied across thousands of archers firing in coordination rather than as individuals. Range superiority of 50 yards had created killing zones, where French forces died without ability to respond effectively. The weather independence that Thomas of Macclesfield had built into English tactical doctrine provided crucial advantage that French planning had ignored. Yew longbows functioning normally in humidity that disabled crossbow strings demonstrated how systematic understanding of materials and environmental conditions could overcome apparent technological inferiority. French commanders had trusted mechanical sophistication over practical adaptability, discovering too late that complex weapons became useless when atmospheric conditions exceeded their operational parameters. Training integration represented perhaps the most significant English innovation, transforming individual archery skill into coordinated military capability through methods borrowed from Welsh mountain warfare and Flemish crossbow companies. French crossbowmen operated as individual specialists, whose personal expertise could not be systematically coordinated, while English archers functioned as components in a military machine designed for maximum collective effectiveness. The psychological preparation required to fire mechanically at human targets, rather than hunting animals, had been systematically addressed through Thomas's training programs in ways that French military education had never considered. Strategic consequences became apparent within months as European military doctrine began fundamental transformation. French survivors like Captain Jean de Hainaut returned home carrying tactical intelligence that would revolutionize continental warfare. Orders went out for increased longbow production and archer training programs, though reproducing English success required cultural changes that challenged fundamental assumptions about military service and social hierarchy. The idea that peasant soldiers could systematically defeat noble cavalry undermined justifications for feudal privileges that had dominated European society for centuries. The technological response revealed how completely Crécy had shattered confidence in traditional military methods. European nobles began investing heavily in cannon development as the only weapon system that might match English archery effectiveness. Artillery experiments that had proceeded slowly for decades suddenly received massive funding as French commanders sought alternatives to cavalry charges that had proven suicidal against coordinated missile fire. The transition from individual combat to industrial warfare had begun irreversibly. Social implications proved as revolutionary as tactical changes, challenging the divine right theories that justified aristocratic political power through claimed military superiority. French nobles who survived Crécy faced uncomfortable questions about why peasant archers could kill knights effortlessly if noble blood truly conferred natural advantages. The fundamental justification for feudal hierarchy, that aristocratic military service earned political privileges, became questionable when English farm boys demonstrated superior battlefield effectiveness, using equipment worth 5 shillings per man. Military academies across Europe began studying English tactical innovations with intensity that traditional military education had never required. Coordinated fire discipline became standard curriculum rather than specialized technique, while ammunition logistics and weather adaptation received systematic attention that medieval warfare had previously ignored. The professional military thinking that would eventually produce standing armies and systematic officer training traced its origins directly to lessons learned from English longbow methodology at Crecy. The long-term influence extended far beyond immediate military applications, as industrial thinking invaded other areas of medieval society. Manufacturing processes that could produce 10,000 arrows daily demonstrated organizational capabilities that challenged traditional craft guild methods. Standardization of equipment specifications, identical bow lengths, uniform arrow weights, coordinated training programs, introduced systematic approaches to human organization that would eventually transform European economic and political structures. International recognition of English tactical superiority became apparent through diplomatic changes that reflected new military realities. European powers that had dismissed England as a peripheral kingdom suddenly sought alliances with forces capable of destroying continental armies through systematic application of coordinated firepower. English longbow methodology influenced military thinking from Scotland to Italy as commanders struggled to adapt traditional tactics to industrial warfare realities. Modern military historians acknowledge Crecy as the first clear example of industrial warfare defeating aristocratic individualism through principles that remain fundamental to contemporary military doctrine. Concentrated firepower, coordinated targeting, systematic training programs, and weather-adapted equipment represent tactical innovations that modern armies have refined but never fundamentally replaced. The mathematical approach to warfare that Thomas of Macclesfield demonstrated, calculating arrow trajectories, coordinating fire patterns, managing ammunition logistics, established analytical methods that influenced military science for centuries. The technological legacy extended through 15 decades of English longbow dominance until gunpowder weapons achieved equivalent fire rates around 1550. Battles like Poitiers and Agincourt proved that Crécy represented systematic innovation rather than fortunate accident, as English archers repeatedly demonstrated tactical superiority over continental forces using identical methods refined through practical experience. French military reformation required 18 months to retrain surviving forces and 15 years to rebuild economic capacity destroyed in 4 hours of coordinated English archery. The Battle of Crécy ultimately demonstrated that medieval innovation often involved sophisticated understanding, working with natural principles rather than against them, challenging modern assumptions about technological progress and historical development. English longbowmen succeeded because they respected mathematical realities of warfare rather than mythological traditions of knightly honor, establishing precedents for systematic military thinking that would eventually transform European civilization and create the analytical foundations of modern military science.